Did St. Patrick commit genocide? Did he kill pagans? Did he battle druids? I'm lumping these questions together because they all make the same general accusation, which is that St. Patrick used violence to spread Christianity in Ireland. And despite what certain corners of the internet might tell you, there's no evidence that St. Patrick committed genocide, nor is there any evidence that he killed or even fought with any of the native Irish he encountered during his ministry, druids included. Let's start with the genocide theory, and boy is this one a doozy. In recent years, memes and social media posts, which tend to surface around St. Patrick's Day, have put forth the baseless claim that Ireland's original inhabitants were Twa pygmies from Central Africa. Allegedly the source of Ireland's folkloric leprechauns, these pygmies were subsequently wiped out by St. Patrick when he came to preach the gospel. If your bullshit detector is going haywire right now, that's a good sign. Your detector is in working order. In their 2019 article, Did St. Patrick Wipe Out an African Pygmy Tribe, the First Inhabitants of Ireland, the fact-checking website Snopes, not surprisingly, rated this claim as false, quoting a historian who called it complete nonsense. Snopes also offered this explanation for why the claim has no basis in reality. And I quote, "The earliest archaeological evidence of human habitation on the island of Ireland dates to between 10,640 and 10,860 BC. No evidence exists to show that Twa pygmies settled the island at any point in history, beyond which it makes little sense to imagine that a traditional hunter-forager people that emerged from landlocked Central Africa would have had the geographical awareness or technical knowledge to construct and sail ships thousands of miles northwest." End quote. At this point, I'd also like to state for the record that anthropologists have a fairly decent understanding of who Ireland's first inhabitants were, something I wrote about over on irishmyths.com. The short version is that during the Paleolithic, they crossed over from mainland Europe via Britain, possibly taking advantage of a land bridge. They clung mostly to the Irish coastline, ate lots of shellfish, and according to pediatrician and Professor Michael Hermanussen's 2003 paper, Stature of Early Europeans, stood on average between 5'2" and 5'9" inches tall, which, for the Stone Age, was actually pretty tall. So, to reiterate, this idea that a race of pygmies or hobbits or Homo florensis inhabited Ireland prior to the arrival of modern humans, thus giving rise to stories of leprechauns, is bogus. Indeed, the mischievous miniature men who now grace boxes of sugary American cereal are likely derived from the Irish god Lugh, who, according to Irish mythology, was driven underground along with the rest of the Tuatha Dé Danann by the Milesians, i.e. Ireland's final invaders, the Gaelic-speaking Celts who arrived in Ireland during the Iron Age. Over time, the once mighty Lugh saw his reputation and stature diminished in Gaelic folktales until he became Little Stooping Lugh, or Lugh Croman, anglicized as Leprechaun. To quote Irish poet W.B. Yeats, "The pagan gods of Ireland, the Tuatha Dé Danann, robbed of worship and offerings, grew smaller and smaller in the popular imagination until they turned into the fairies." And that comes from the 1888 book Fairy and Folktales of the Irish Peasantry. St. Patrick, warrior wizard? Now, as for St. Patrick killing pagans and doing battle with druids, such accounts are as equally folkloric as the tales of fairies and leprechauns. They were invented by believers who, perhaps not enthralled by Patrick's own version of events, wanted to inject a bit more excitement into his life story. In one account, written 2 centuries after Patrick's death, the saint has a Gandalf vs. Saruman-style showdown with a druid, which ends with Patrick sending the druid flying through the air. The druid crashes to the ground and breaks his skull. Definitely not what Jesus had in mind when he said, "Turn the other cheek." The reality is that Patrick seemingly cared about and respected the people he was converting. Instead of fighting druids, he would have been more likely to recruit them. As folklorist and Professor Julian Osborne McKnight explains in her 2015 book, The Story We Carry in Our Bones, Irish History for Americans, Patrick's biographers, 2 monks named Tirchan and Merchu, as well as many later hagiographers, mythologized Patrick into someone he never was, a man who fought with druids, used shamrocks to teach the Trinity, and drove the snakes from Ireland. In truth, many druids became priests of the new religion. Patrick surely didn't need shamrocks to teach a people who already had tripartite gods, and Ireland never had any snakes in the first place. End quote. However, just because Patrick never killed anyone during his many years in Ireland, that doesn't mean he never killed anyone ever. Why did St. Patrick write his confession? This is one of the biggest mysteries, if not the biggest mystery, surrounding St. Patrick. Let me lay the groundwork for you. Back when Patrick was undergoing his religious training, he made a confession to one of his closest friends. This was how the Catholic concept of confession went down back in Patrick's time. It was a declaration one made publicly or to a friend. So Patrick, following standard operating procedure, spilled the beans. At age 15, before he was kidnapped into slavery, Patrick committed a sin. In his own words, it was something he had done, quote, in one hour. Decades later, that hour-long lapse in judgment would come back to haunt him. Patrick's contemporaries, including his own family back in Britain, were none too happy about his going to Ireland. They couldn't understand why he'd want to leave the civilized Roman world to go preach to a bunch of what they considered to be barbarians. They didn't trust him, and when they learned that Patrick would sometimes pay Irish kings for protection so that he might have access to potential converts, something Patrick freely admitted to, they lashed out. To quote Dublin-based historian and archaeologist Terry O'Hagan's 2015 JSTOR Daily article, "Will the Real St. Patrick Please Stand Up?", Patrick was accused of having ulterior motives for going back to Ireland on his own volition. His ability to attract healthy donations and his dispensing of payments to pagans was viewed as highly suspicious. They seem to have accused him of financial irregularities and profiteering from Christian services. Patrick's defense against such claims was that this was the cultural reality on the ground. He categorically denied personally profiting from any such activities and presents his mission as one which was constantly spending whatever it received on further expansion and security." End quote. These attacks on St. Patrick's character are likely what prompted him to write his confession. The attacks culminated in Patrick's close friend betraying him and making public the sin he had already confessed to some 30 years earlier. But if you take the time to peruse Patrick's confession, you might notice something. Patrick's hour-long lapse in judgment is conspicuously absent. He doesn't mention the sin. The people want to know, Patrick, what was it? Considering he was 15 at the time, an age when hormones are notoriously raging, a sin of a sexual nature seems plausible. However, some scholars suggest that participation in a pagan ritual is a more likely candidate, as sexual sins weren't really considered a big deal back then, and whatever this sin was, the church hierarchy took it seriously. Here's Osborne McKnight's explanation of the pagan ritual sin theory, and I quote, "Patrick grew up in a Romanized area that was being abandoned by the Roman soldiery who were being called back to the mother country. Many Romans practiced a pagan religion called Mithraism, based on a Persian boy who slays a white bull, returns fertility to the harvest, and is rewarded with life in heaven. This was an appealing and hopeful religion for soldiers who were trained and paid to fight and die. Perhaps Patrick participated in one of their temple ceremonies. We will never know." End quote. Author and scholar Thomas Cahill has another theory, however, one that connects the sin of Patrick's youth to older Patrick's abhorrence of violence. Was St. Patrick a murderer? Surely murder is a sin of a serious enough nature that Patrick would have felt compelled to share it, to unburden himself of it prior to his ordination. As Cahill explains in his 1995 book, How the Irish Saved Civilization, my guess is that the sin was murder. He was 15, and how many sins are available to a 15-year-old that would still bother him by midlife, especially after a life as various and harsh as Patrick's? Despite Augustine's later preoccupations, sexual sins were not high on most people's lists those days. Theft on a grand scale would have been even more unlikely given his family's atmosphere and attentiveness. But murder, especially of a slave or servant, would have borne no social consequences, nor would it have meant much to the murderer until he found himself at the receiving end of someone else's brutality. In any case, the ferocity of this normally placid, quiet man courses to the surface only when slavery or human carnage is the subject. End quote. If true, this event would rewrite or at least add a dark amendment to St. Patrick's accepted origin story of well-off Welshman turned slave who saw the light and dedicated his life to Christ. And while he's often depicted smiting, smitten the Irish pagan god Crom Cruach in his later incarnation, the demon Crom Dove, there are no historical accounts of the Apostle of Ireland fighting anyone, let alone gods or demons, though it seems likely that Patrick did battle some internal demons. Regardless of whether he was spurred on by his guilt from having murdered someone in addition to having been spurred on by his experiences as a slave, Patrick would go on to become one of the world's first abolitionists. Throughout his ministry, he spoke out against the institution of slavery, castigating both the British, via his letter to Coroticus, and his adopted people, the Irish, for participating in the slave trade. Within Patrick's lifetime, or shortly thereafter, the Irish slave trade ceased, and violent acts of all kinds, including murder and intertribal warfare, decreased, according to Cahill, a direct result of Patrick's influence, perhaps. Compared to other early Christian proselytizers who often incited violence rather than seeking to quench it, Patrick was, well, a saint, or at the very least, a pretty decent guy. And far from being a mass murderer, all evidence points to him being an ardent pacifist. Here, I'll let Cahill have the final word. And I quote, "Patrick was really a first, the first missionary to barbarians beyond the reach of Roman law. The step he took was in its way as bold as Columbus's, and 1,000 times more humane." If you enjoyed this video, please like and comment and basically just tap all of the shiny buttons, and by the end of it, make sure you are subscribed to the Irish Myths channel. That really, really helps. And if you want to learn more controversial facts about Ireland's favorite patron saint, check out my book, St. Patrick in Your Pocket, 20 Questions with the Apostle of Ireland. My name is I.E. Neverday, editor of the short story collection Neon Druid and the creator of IrishMyths.com. Thanks for coming out.